Well, hello again, and thanks for returning to Classic Dirtbike TV. Now in this next video we're going to take a look at this quite nice looking 1979 Italian made Beta 250 Twinshocker. Now this bike is another rare classic from the Terry Pickering classic dirt bike collection, although this time round this is not a bike that Terry's restored or refurbished, but Terry bought this particular machine from another vintage dirt bike collecting friend called Dave Drabble. Now Beta motorcycles of course are much more familiar for making trials machines rather than these old motocrossers, although Beta did start making bicycles a way back in the early 1900s, and of course it wasn't too long before they then moved on to building mopeds and smaller motorcycles for the Italian masses. Now the company's name Beta is taken from the initials of the people who started and then ran the company, which were Bianchi, Enzo, Tossi and Arrigo, and Beta are still to this day still manufacturing trials, enduro and even electric bikes. So it's one of the few surviving Italian based motorcycle makers, and certainly they have a lot of history over the last 100 years. Although this particular 1979 250 motocrosser is quite a rare little machine, because Beta never really made a lot of motocross racers during their early days, and after about 1980 I think Beta then tended to concentrate its production on building their hugely successful trials machines. But the engine was a single cylinder two-stroke, which by all accounts was a quite decent power plant and quite rugged and reliable for 1979, and the fuel was fed to the motor by a big 54 Bing carburetor, which of course sucked its air through a foam air filter and a plastic airbox. Now I'm not entirely sure if this is a fully original bike from 1979, although a large percentage of the parts are certainly authentic and correct for that period, and as I said, it's quite rare to see one of these old Italian Betas in the flesh, so to speak, because in terms of classic and vintage motocross you just don't see these rare bikes at race events these days. You may of course catch a glimpse of one if you were racing in Italy or France back in the day, but here in the UK these are a pretty rare sight indeed. But nonetheless, it's a nice looking machine with its chrome steel molly frame and that light 250 two-stroke motor, which made this particular machine quite a competitive little package. Now, as you'd expect, because this is a thoroughbred Italian race bike, lots of local parts are used on it, including this set of Seriani forks, which were pretty good for a 1970s motocross machine, and they were not only used on these Beta motorcycles but many other makes and models of off-road bikes during the 1970s and 1980s. Drum brakes again, as this was still of course the 1970s, and it would be a few years more down the line before we would see more modern hydraulic brakes fitted to future Beta machines. But these older drums did enough to slow the bike down when it was required, because drum brakes were still the stopping technology for the 1970s. Now, with regards to the bike's rear suspension, I'm again not entirely sure as to what's actually fitted on this particular bike, although I'd hazard a guess and say that they would either be Italian Corti Cossas or maybe even Marzocchi units, purely because of this bike's Italian origins. But whatever make of shocks are in place here, they certainly look period correct for 1979. Now, once again, a substantial alloy chain guide on this little 250 Beta, although I'm not sure if that rear brake cable has been routed correctly, although this bike could still of course be a work in progress type of machine. Now, a nicely styled alloy fuel tank on our Beta with that Italian flag emblazoned on the side, and these fuel cells would have held just over 2 gallons of gas, which was usually enough to feed that 250 motor during a race. And again, the tank was secured to the frame by these leather straps, just like the old works machines of their day. But as motocross race tanks go, these Beta fuel cells were certainly stylish. Now, I'm not sure if our Beta here has seen much action on the track, because the bike's exhaust expansion chamber certainly looks in surprisingly good condition for a bike that's now more than 42 years old. And even this Italian-made SEM steel tailpipe looks free from any damage, so who knows, maybe our little Beta 250 hasn't seen much track action in quite some time. But this seat looks like it would be quite a good place to rest your weary backside on from time to time in between the bumps. And this was, of course, one of the common factors of these old crossers from back in the day. They all seem to have very reasonably comfortable seats. But then again, this was more than likely to make up for their limited suspension technology that these bikes had in the 1970s. Now again, I'm not sure if our particular Beta has had a makeover since 1979, but my guess is that it has had some kind of refurbishment since then, as the paintwork and metal surfaces all look in pretty good condition, and the bikes, it certainly looks like it's been used at one time or another. But it's just good to be able to have a look at what one of these European Beta 250s looked like from that 1970s era. Now again, the bike's controls look like a set of Magura levers and a quality Gunnar Gasser throttle twist grip. Now I don't think the bars are correct for 1979, but many of them aren't in this modern day, as riders tend to fit whichever type of bars suit their own personal riding style best. But as I said, there's not many of these old Beta motocrossers around these days, because many weren't really produced in 1979, as Beta tended to concentrate on the more lucrative trials market at the start of 1980. But our featured bike is a lovely piece of motocross history, but again, it was the flood of Japanese motocross motorcycles into Europe in the 1970s that pushed out its smaller manufacturers like Beta, who, although they were still building decent quality machines, they just couldn't match the volume and price of the Japanese bikes, which were selling across Europe and in the USA in their hundreds of thousands. Although, having said that, Beta soon progressed to building a monoshock version of this bike a couple of years later, and we'll take a look at an example of one of those machines in another up-and-coming video here on Classic Dirt Bike TV, so make sure you take a look at that. Although not many Italian motorcycle companies survived the onslaught of the Japanese invasion, and many manufacturers such as TGM, Ancelotti and Motovilla found it very hard to compete in this cutthroat motocross market, and for many of them it was a fight that they had no chance of winning. Although it has to be said that Beta were the exception to this time period, who are still trading today and continue to build very high quality enduros, trials and other off-roaders for the world market. But as I said, it's just great to see one of these old Beta Twinshockers in the flesh, and this example of Terry Pickering's is a rare insight into what kind of motorcycles Beta were producing through that golden decade of the 1970s. So thanks again for coming back to my YouTube channel, and I do hope you enjoyed this brief look around this 1979 Beta 250, and I do hope you'll all retune once again very soon to see more of these vintage classics from back in the day, right here on your favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.